Hello friends, how are you? My name is Ari Thurger and today I'm going to talk about what the Nordic people's consumption habits were during the Middle Ages. This is December, finally, and what's this season all about? The birth of Christ? No, not quite. This is a time to celebrate with the family and the community the wonderful Yule traditions and eat all sorts of good stuff. That's what this season is all about. Food. Now, this video was requested by one of my patrons, Mr. Paul Dobson. Thank you so much, my good friend. There's a lot to say about the food and drink of the Nordic peoples during the Viking Age. I could honestly write a book solely about this subject, so I am assuming this is going to be a long video. So with no more delay, let's get started. I'll start this video by giving you a quick panorama of agriculture during the Middle Ages in Scandinavia so you can better perceive the eating habits of the Norse. Agriculture in the Viking period was not very developed. Traces of land plowed by the Vikings show that the furrows were very shallow, the trenches where you plant the seeds. These furrows were opened up using a primitive plow, most likely pulled by an ox. The Vikings essentially cultivated grains such as wheat, barley, oats, etc. In Denmark, agriculture was a disgrace since forever. During the history of Denmark, agriculture was never very successful, which is why during the Iron Age there were great migrations to the south into Germanic lands and over the seas into Britain. So it wasn't different during the Viking period. The Danes were quite used to sea voyages and their economy depended greatly on trading. In Sweden, agriculture was successful in the south to a certain extent due to its geographical features, and it's no coincidence that in southern Sweden people had a great adoration for the god Freyr, the god linked to fertility, agriculture, wealth and plenty. Freyr was indeed the king and the god of the Swedes. But the further north you go, the lands start to be more mountainous, the soils are harder to work, frozen, rocky, and to the west lies Norway, a country even harder to make agriculture. The most fertile lands lie near the sea, in the fjords, the region of Trondheim, for instance. Everybody was fighting for that land precisely due to its fertile lands and a very reasonable location for agriculture and other economic activities. So, in the case of Norway, there was a lot of political pressure and internal conflicts, so agriculture was also scarce. So, we have three main factors that shape the eating habits of the Norse: climate, lifestyle, and isolation. Winters in Scandinavia are longer and darker. You can't do much agriculture, so your survival depended on storing food, gathering food in the forest as much as you could, all sorts of edible berries and dried fruits, fishing, hunting, and of course you really needed to preserve the food and store it to have something to eat when it was absolutely impossible to go out to gather food when winter was harder and unforgiving. Precisely due to the harsh and cold climate, a lot of plants simply don't exist in Scandinavia. So, in terms of vegetables, the menu was limited. Smoked, dried and salted foods were certainly the most consumed during the Viking period. Because the lifestyle of Nordic peoples during the Viking Age was turned to the sea, you can expect a lot of dishes based on fish, obviously. Håkar, fermented shark, for instance. It was dried in the open for several weeks and the smell was abominable. Artfiskur, dried fish, it's still very much consumed in Iceland and it is as hard as a shoe. Rokt fisk, smoked fish, fiskasopa, fish soup of cod or stripped base, etc. Of course, not everyone was able to go out into the sea or live as a fisherman. Isolated populations far from the sea had their own eating habits. Viking farms were very small. Like I said, there wasn't much to cultivate aside from grains, but there were farm animals, ox and goats, for instance. Normally, Vikings were not like hobbits, sadly. A typical family in a farming community had at least 2 meals a day. Dagmal was the first meal of the day, literally day meal. This meal depends on the historical accounts, really. It could be the very first meal after rising, or could be the meal after breakfast. Rismal. Dagmal would be more or less at about 8 o'clock in the morning, which is pretty late for a farming community, so I'm assuming that was the second meal of the day. What we have to take into consideration is that to the Norse, a day was divided into 8 moments, and each with 3 hours, forming a total of 24 hours. And then there was the nattmal, or night meal, at the end of the working day. During the day, children would usually eat porridge and dried fruits, or perhaps buttermilk and bread, while adults had something more consistent, a stew, some bread, butter, etc. During the evening meal, it could be fish or meat, even stew with vegetables, and the leftovers were probably the next day's morning meal. Nowadays, we are used to eat a cookie or some sweet after meal, so to the Norse I'm sure it wasn't different, although they had few options because honey was the only sweetener the Vikings knew. So everything sweet would have been made of honey, practically almost like everyone else across Europe. But about honey I shall develop further ahead. Yes, I know you are thinking about mead. We will get to that. Well, I have spoken about stew. Meat was cooked with vegetables and breads over the earth in an open fire pit in the middle of the house. The meat most often was cooked in holes dug in the floor, which were used as earth ovens. In the center of the house there was a long fire. The meat was placed in holes with hot embers, and the holes were covered. The meat was also either roasted on a spit over the fire or boiled in a soapstone pot or iron cauldrons. Hot stones were placed into the liquid to make the stew, and the hot stones made it boil. Stew was a very typical Norse dish, or of course the stew was different depending on how wealthy a family was or their direct contact with urban centers and trading activities. It could just be a stew made of meat from farm animals, wild greens, some basic vegetables like turnip and also with bread. Or for wealthy families, in great feasts, the stew could contain all sorts of meat and vegetables and even foreign products such as pepper. Costlier spices were imported and added to the foods of wealthier Vikings. Speaking of meat and the preservation of food, it wasn't just smoking and letting it dry. There is something quite interesting the Vikings did to preserve meat. Something very, very characteristic of Viking food products is skyr. It was introduced in Iceland by Norwegian settlers, and to this day it's still consumed in Iceland. Skyr is a cultured dairy product similar to strained yogurt. It's a semi-liquid and solid white thing with a very sour taste, bitter taste. I actually like it and consume it quite a lot. The whey left after making skyr was left to go sour and used to store meat. I mean, the sour whey was used to preserve cooked meats in the winter. Well, alright, this was just an introduction, a shallow idea of what the Vikings consumed and the factors that influenced their eating habits. Now let's move on to the good stuff. Let's develop this a bit more. When it comes to mythological accounts, we often find it amusing, the stories of the gods and their adventures. But if we look close enough, the myths tells us a lot about the mind of our ancestors and also their life, how things were conducted. Myths are the reflection of a culture. And there is one particular mythological account that gives us some indications of what the Vikings ate. The poem is Rígstula, or Rígismol, the Lay of Rígr. This poem is about the god Heimdallr, and his journey to the world of mankind. It comes in his disguise as Rigr. This is an interesting poem because the social differences in Norse society are marked by what people consumed. The poem describes the different living conditions of certain members of the Norse society. For instance, Rigr enters in contact with a thrall, which is commonly translated as a slave, but not in the sense of the word we are accustomed to. Thralls were paid workers, but even so they were very low on the ranking position of the Norse society. Anyway, he comes to the house of a thrall, and there is the description of what a slave consumed, essentially a bowl of soup and hard bread. I'll quote: "Great-grandmother fetched a coarse-baked loaf, all heavy and thick and crammed with husk. She bore it forth in the middle of the dish, with broth in a bowl, and laid the board." Now, I'm not going to develop on the poem because on this video we are focusing on what type of food the Vikings consumed. So let's move on. After Rigr enters in contact with the thrall, he moves on to a farm, 2 people higher in rank compared with the thrall, free folk, farmers with their own property, but still quite humble. Their clothes were not richly made, just simple people. I'll quote the part about the food. "Grandmother set forth plenteous dishes. Cooked was the calf of dainties best. Thence Rigr uprose, prepared to rest. Well he knew how to give them counsel. He laid him down in the middle of the bed, and the home folk twain upon either side." So what we have to retain here is that farmers consumed cooked meat, and in this case a calf, which means they most likely had cows and oxen to plow the fields. You didn't own such animals just to eat their babies. So most likely what is implicit here was the type of food I have spoken earlier: stew with cooked meat, vegetables and wild greens. Owning a cow, there is the possibility of having milk and butter even. So clearly a farmer's eating habits were way better and healthier than a thrall's. Then Rigr moves on to a house of a jarl, a member of the nobility, a chieftain. These were the sort of people who could afford their own private army, various properties with tenants who paid their taxes, and could afford to have boats and launch their own raids to increase their wealth. After a description of the rich garments the people of this house wore, we move on to the part of the food. Then took mother a figured cloth, white of linen, and covered the board. Thereafter took she a fine-baked loaf, white of wheat, and covered the cloth. Next she brought forth plenteous dishes, set with silver, and spread the board with brown fried bacon and roasted birds. There was wine in a vessel and rich wrought goblets. They drank and revelled while they went by. So as you can see, the food was much better in this case. Fine wheat bread, bacon, birds, possibly chicken, goose, duck, pigeon, etc. So they had access to both farm animals and wild animals. And there was wine, probably imported, wine mixed with spices, the famous Greek hypokras, heated wine mixed with sugar and spices, usually including cinnamon. Practically the same thing as the famous glögg, the traditional Scandinavian mulled wine, tremendously popular in Denmark, Norway and Sweden, especially throughout the Christmas holidays. By the end of this video I'll give you the recipe. Well, the last person Rigr visits is a king, although the king's food choices are not described, but we can only imagine how great the feasts must have been, judging by the food choices of his subjects, as previously demonstrated. Although it does speak about hunting, and hunting has always been an activity greatly linked to nobility. hunting big game, so we can expect all sorts of meat, the best food choices without a doubt. This poem demonstrates the foundations of the Norse society and the people who were the backbone of these medieval communities: servants, farmers, nobles, and kings. I think this poem is very interesting to understand the different social status within the Norse society, and the higher their status, the best and healthier the food choices. So far in this video, what do we know about the eating habits of the Vikings? They consumed meat from livestock, cattle, pig, sheep, horse, and we will get to that further ahead, goat, chicken, and most likely other products linked to these animals, such as milk, butter, cheese, and eggs. And they probably ate dog as well, and I leave that for later. Meat from hunting. Nobles would eat deer and wild boar. These were considered luxury foods. Nobles controlled the hunting grounds. Seals and whales were hunted by most Scandinavians living closer to the sea. And of course, reindeer made a large part of the Scandinavian diet. Reindeer was exactly what led people to settle in Scandinavia. After the end of the last ice age, they came from the south, from nowadays Portugal and Spain, during the last glacial period, and followed reindeer to the north, into Scandinavia. Prehistoric reindeer herders migrated to Scandinavia during the Paleolithic, and reindeer remain to this day in their diet. In terms of fish, in coastal areas, for the menu, Vikings had herring, garfish, salmon, cod, and let's not forget about marine mollusks such as mussels, cockles, and oysters. I'll show you further ahead when we get to the archaeological findings, because I've spent 6 months dealing with food remains left by Nordic and Germanic peoples, and there were loads of oysters. Fruits, vegetables, and berries most gathered in the forests, including roots, but turnips, cabbages, and leeks were the most common among farmers. Barley, oats, wheat, we also know of some seeds that were found in grave mounds, and then of course we have honey, which was the only sweetener, and it was used in both food and drinks, such as mead. In terms of drinks, the main Viking alcoholic beverages were mead and beer. Mead made of honey, of course, and the beer was ale made from barley. And yes, the wine, most likely either imported or it was wine made with fruits from the various fruits that grew in the Vikings' homelands, depending on the country really. Wine made from grapes was imported. Archaeology is what gives us a lot of information about the Viking diet. For instance, speaking of beer, in archaeological excavations of farms dating back to the Viking period, fire-cracked stones have been found. And then you ask, but Harith, stones? What does that have to do with beer? And then I answer, Nordic peoples brewed beer by using stones. It's magic, of course. Now, all right, Vikings and their descendants brewed beer by tossing hot rocks into wooden kettles. Stones were used for cooking and to brew beer. And this was before the existence of iron pots, of course. The stones were heated until they were quite hot and then placed into wooden vessels to heat things up. The great majority of these stones are found in ancient farms of the Viking period, which shows this type of activity was almost exclusive from farming communities. We must not forget that beer was an important part of social and religious institutions at that time. I mean, there were laws on the brewing of beer. At least 3 farmers were required to work together to brew beer, which then had to be blessed. An individual who failed to brew beer for 3 successive years had to give half of his farm to the bishop when Christianity took hold, or the other half to the king, and then leave the country. But only very small farms were exempt from this strict regulation. Speaking of mead, Everybody loves mead. I, for one, will be honest with you. I don't know what the fuzz is all about, I'm sorry. Give me a cold, black and golden beer and I'm a happy man. Mead, it's made of honey, of course, obviously. Now, I would like to share with you something that I find interesting about the production of honey during the Viking period and the Middle Ages of other countries. In Scandinavia, there were stone constructions of the Viking period that no one knew what they were used for. They were thought to be traps to catch wolves. Now, I'm going to try to explain the configuration of these structures. They were round, made of stone. They became gradually narrower at the top, almost like a cone. And then there is no ceiling, just an opening like a chimney, and no entrances to these structures. Just from the top, looks like a tower. A couple of years ago, I was still taking my degree in archaeology, and with a professor of mine and other students and a friend of mine who was writing his thesis on medieval farm constructions, we were studying those exact same structures from the exact same period, but in Portugal. And they were not used to catch wolves. They were a sort of fortresses for beehives to protect the bees and the hives from bears. And this discovery completely changed the idea Scandinavians had of these structures. So bears couldn't get in to destroy the beekeepers' properties. The only way in was through the ceiling. And if a bear could climb, it would fall down. And there was no way of escaping, and the bear ended up being killed, and it was another source of food. And the beehives were kept safe. We have already talked about meat consumption during the Viking period. And I would like to talk a bit about horses and dogs. These two animals were by far the most sacrificed animals in religious and magical activities in ancient Scandinavia. Both horses and dogs were considered noble animals, and in many sacrifices, parts of these animals were consumed. Nowadays, our Western societies are shocked by the dog consumption in Asian countries. But the truth is, eating dog in the Western society, in many cases including Ireland, was still a thing in the middle of the 20th century, just the past century. There were butcher shops just for dogs. That's exactly where the concept of hot dogs comes from. Nowadays it's not dog, of course, but those sausages used to be made of dog, hot dogs. It was quite normal in prehistoric times to consume dogs. We see this in archaeological records. There were dogs with the sole purpose of aiding in hunting and to protect the settlements, and other specific dogs were food reservations for winter time. I've spoken about this before on a video I've made about Indo-European wolf rights. Obviously, not all horses and dogs who were sacrificed were also consumed. Many grave mounds, especially sheep burials, the animals weren't butchered. They were laid whole and intact to be used in the afterlife. But there are many burials with only parts of the animal, depending on the spiritual purpose, of course, but we see markings of scraping in the bones, so the meat was taken and consumed. Sometimes just the head of the horse was deposited and the rest of the animal was consumed. Horse heads have a great connection to black magic and curses, such as the case of the kneading pole. I shall talk about that on another video. But let me give you an example. I took these photos and in a pile of bones there was a horse's head. There you have, I dug that up and it was in a pile of food waste. And since I'm talking about my own work, see those bags? They are filled with food waste, mostly boar, goat, sheep and many oysters and clams. Now, bread was also very much consumed. The typical Viking age bread was made of barley flour, flax seeds, lard or butter, and salt. The chemical analysis of salt in various products of the Viking age, especially from bread, shows that the salt was either explored in the coast of Scandinavia or was imported from the Baltic region. We also find herbs, seeds, mushrooms, and other psychotropic substances in burials, but in those terms we are entering in the traditional medicine and also religious and magical activities, and nothing to do with the consumption of something to acquire some sort of nourishment. In terms of most important archaeological exhibitions that gives us a lot of information about the Viking diet comes from Jorvik, nowadays York in England, Berka in Sweden, Osberg in Norway, Jarlshof, Shetland Isles, and Dublin in Ireland. With the exception of York, in the other places we find almost the same type of diet. 50 to 60% is meat and fish. Pig, cow, ox, chicken, goat, wild goose. In terms of fish, obviously cod and herring. In terms of grains, mostly it's oats, wheat, barley. Vegetables, we have carrots, cabbages, turnips, and dried fruits such as hazelnuts and walnuts. In Jorvik, due to its geographical features, different climate, river proximity, the Viking diet in there was quite diverse and healthy. There was a lot to choose from. Jorvik Vikings ate all sorts of farm and wild animals, different vegetables, grains, fruits, and because it was a very important city right in the middle of Great Britain, there was a lot of training, so these Vikings had access to spices and different beverages other than the usual beer and mead. The most famous poop in history is from a Viking of Jorvik, and that gave a lot of information about the diet of these people in Viking Age York. And of course, I took a picture. I don't know who dropped that, but it must have hurt. The Viking poop is in exhibition in the Jorvik Viking Center in the city of York. Isn't history fun? So that's it, my friends. I hope you have enjoyed this video. A very special thanks to my patron, Mr. Paul Dobson, who requested this video. Stick around a bit longer, I will give you a couple of recipes according to the archaeological findings. Thank you so much for watching, see you on the next video, and as always, ta for real.